We are talking about an assassination attempt at a black-tie dinner in Washington, a near-shooting war in the Persian Gulf, a European monarch flying into a diplomatic firestorm, a new pope drawing a moral line in the sand hours after the United States government decided that firing squads are acceptable tools of justice, jihadist insurgents rocking the capital of a West African country, a Russian economy quietly bleeding out, and farmers in the American heartland wondering if this is the year they finally lose everything. And if you think these stories are separate, unrelated events, then I promise you by the end of this you will think again. So hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below telling me which story shocked you the most, give this a like if you believe the world deserves honest coverage, and let us get into it. Let us start with what happened last night at the Washington Hilton, because this is the story that quite literally stopped the room. The White House Correspondents Dinner is a tradition going back to 1921. It is the one night every year when the press and the presidency sit in the same room, eat the same meal, and pretend for a few hours that the relationship between power and journalism is still functioning. Last night, that illusion was shattered. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but by actual gunfire. A 31-year-old man from Torrance, California named Cole Thomas Allen, a part-time tutor, a mechanical engineering graduate from the California Institute of Technology, a video game developer who sold an indie game on Steam for $1.99, charged through a security checkpoint at the Washington Hilton Hotel, armed with a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives. He fired. A Secret Service agent was struck by at least one round. That agent survived only because he was wearing a bulletproof vest. Cole Allen was subdued, taken to a hospital, and President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, the First Lady, and the entire cabinet were rushed off the stage while hundreds of formally dressed guests dived under their dinner tables as a voice screamed, "Get down!" Now let us be very clear about what happened here. This was not a protest. This was not a demonstration. This was a man who, according to two law enforcement sources, told investigators after his arrest that he wanted to shoot Trump administration officials. He planned it. He booked a room at the hotel. He waited for his moment. He charged the checkpoint when security was transitioning, when the metal detectors were being dismantled because the president had already been seated, and he nearly succeeded. Cole Allen is now facing charges under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 111, which covers assaulting a federal officer. He is also charged under Section 924C, which carries mandatory minimum sentences for using a firearm during a crime of violence. The United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, and pay attention to who that is, Jeanine Pirro, the former Fox News host turned chief federal prosecutor for the nation's capital, announced those charges Saturday night. More charges, she said, are expected as the investigation continues. Think about what I just said. A man with a Caltech degree, a Teacher of the Month award, and a $2 video game just became the most recent entry in a growing and deeply disturbing catalog of political violence in the United States. This is the same country where a gunman nearly killed Donald Trump at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, where another man, Ryan Routh, was convicted of attempting to assassinate the president and received a life sentence in February. The United States is a country where the president is targeted with enough frequency that Trump himself at the press conference last night compared himself to Abraham Lincoln when asked why he keeps surviving. He said completely unprompted that the most impactful people in history are the ones who get targeted and hunted. Abraham Lincoln was shot dead in a theater. I will leave you to sit with that for a moment, but here is what I want you to think about beyond the immediate drama. This country has no meaningful federal red flag law. The Gun Control Act of 1968 exists. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 exists. But Congress has repeatedly refused to pass universal background checks, to close the gun show loophole, to create a national standard for red flag laws. Cole Allen had no known prior criminal record. Under current federal law, he could legally acquire firearms. He did. He brought them to a hotel in the nation's capital during an event attended by the president and the entire cabinet. The only thing that stood between this man and mass political assassination was a bulletproof vest on a Secret Service agent's chest. Now let us move to the Persian Gulf, because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is one of the most consequential and underreported geopolitical standoffs since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I am really not being hyperbolic. I want you to understand the full context here. On the 28th of February 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was assassinated in those early strikes. Iran's military was severely degraded, and Iran's response, one of the few cards it had left, was to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which, in peacetime, roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its liquefied natural gas travels every single day. When that strait closes, the entire global economy feels it. A temporary ceasefire was agreed on the 8th of April, then it collapsed. Iran began charging ships over $1 million per vessel to transit what it controls of the strait. The United States declared its own naval blockade, not of the strait itself, but of all Iranian ports and coastal areas, beginning on the 13th of April. Within the first 24 hours, United States Central Command reported over 10,000 military personnel, more than a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft enforcing that operation. Here is where we stand today. This Sunday, the 26th of April, the United States Navy has redirected 37 ships bound for or departing from Iranian ports. Iran, in response, has closed the strait to all foreign shipping, seized several foreign-flagged vessels, fired on others, and called the American blockade, in the words of Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, an act of war. Iran's parliamentary speaker and chief negotiator Mohammad Begher Ghalibaf has said a full ceasefire only makes sense if Washington lifts its naval blockade. The Iranians are saying in plain language, you cannot bomb us, blockade us, strangle our economy, and then expect us to negotiate as equals. And as a matter of international law under the 1909 Declaration of London, reinforced through subsequent customary international law, a naval blockade is technically an act of war. The United States knows this, it is doing it anyway. Now this is where it gets even messier. Trump last night announced he is cancelling the peace mission altogether. Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, both were supposed to fly to Islamabad for a second round of negotiations with Iranian officials this weekend. Iran's foreign minister had already left Pakistan by the time Trump announced, via post naturally, that too much time was being wasted traveling. The talks are dead, and here is a detail that tells you everything about how this administration operates. Leaks from inside the Trump White House published by the Wall Street Journal and CNN say that Trump's own Truth Social posts are killing the Iran peace talks. His officials are going to reporters off the record and saying that every time the president goes online and announces Iran is collapsing and losing $500 million a day, the Iranian side digs in harder. Diplomacy, as anyone who has studied it knows, requires at minimum the appearance of dignity for both parties. You do not force a sovereign country to negotiate by publicly humiliating it. Iran's leaders, whatever their many faults, are playing to a domestic audience. When the American president posts on social media that Iran's military and police cannot get paid and the country is in an SOS situation, Iranian officials cannot come to the table without looking like they are surrendering on their knees. They will not do it. So where does this leave us? 20% of the world's oil supply is moving through a strait simultaneously blockaded by both the United States and Iran. Brent crude oil has climbed back above $100 per barrel. Shipping companies, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, have suspended transits through the related routes. The global insurance markets have essentially refused to cover vessels in the region. Every day the strait stays closed. Developing economies in Asia and Africa that depend on affordable energy absorb a shock that their populations feel at the petrol pump, at the grocery store, and in the price of everything that moves by truck or ship. The diplomacy that could end this has just been cancelled via social media, and into this chaos steps King Charles III. The King and Queen Camilla arrive in Washington today for a 4-day state visit, the first state visit of Trump's second term. Britain and the United States have had a fraught relationship since Trump returned to power. The transatlantic alliance has been strained by tariffs, by Trump's warm overtures to Putin, by his contempt for NATO spending commitments. Some in London are hoping the royal presence can paper over those cracks. Some are hoping King Charles can serve as a kind of diplomatic lubricant between two governments that have been quietly pulling apart. But here is the thing about royal state visits. They are not policy, they are theatre. Magnificent, ancient, historically resonant theatre, but theatre nonetheless. The King of England cannot unimpose Trump's tariffs on British steel and aluminum. He cannot recommit the United States to the Paris Agreement. He cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz. What he can do is provide Trump with the legitimacy of being received by one of the world's oldest monarchies and give the British government the impression of influence in exchange for the symbolism of a state banquet. Whether that trade is worth it is a question British politicians will be debating for years. Now let us go to Rome, because the new Pope has entered the building and he has done so in direct moral confrontation with the United States Department of Justice. Pope Leo XIV issued a video message this week reiterating the Catholic Church's teaching that the death penalty is inadmissible, and he did this hours after the United States Department of Justice announced it would permit firing squads as a method of execution for federal death sentences. The last federal execution by firing squad in American history occurred in 1936. The Trump administration is bringing it back. This is not a minor procedural update. This is a statement about what the most powerful government on earth believes it is acceptable to do to a human being in the name of justice. The Pope's position has been unambiguous since Pope Francis updated the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 2018 to declare capital punishment inadmissible in all cases under all circumstances. Pope Leo XIV is reaffirming that position in his first days in office with full knowledge of the timing. Now, you might say the Pope and the United States Department of Justice have always disagreed about things. Fine, but think about the political composition of the current United States Supreme Court. 6 of its 9 justices are Catholic. Think about the Republicans who invoke their Catholic faith to restrict abortion rights, to oppose same-sex marriage, to argue for the sanctity of human life, and then ask yourself how those same politicians are defending firing squads for federal prisoners. The contradiction is not just theological, it is a stress test for the identity of an entire political movement. Now, while all of that was happening in Washington and Rome and the Persian Gulf, let us go to West Africa, because the city of Bamako, the capital of Mali, came under one of the most significant coordinated attacks it has seen in years on the morning of April 25th. Armed groups, including jihadist insurgents affiliated with the Islamic State and separatist rebel factions, launched simultaneous attacks on multiple military and government targets across Bamako and other Malian cities. Gunfire and explosions rang through a city of nearly 3 million people in the early morning hours. The Malian armed forces, together with Russian military personnel, because Mali expelled French forces years ago and replaced them with Wagner Group contractors now operating under direct Russian state oversight, repelled the attack. But the fact that it happened at all tells you something critical. The Sahel is not stabilizing, it is fracturing. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the 3 countries that make up the alliance of Sahel states, have collectively expelled French forces, turned away from the economic community of West African states, aligned with Russia, and are now facing a terrorist insurgency that is growing stronger, not weaker, despite the presence of Russian fighters. The Islamist insurgency is expanding into Benin, Togo, and Côte d'Ivoire with a speed that regional analysts find alarming. The Bamako attack is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a regional collapse that the world's media pays almost no attention to because the countries involved are poor and do not produce oil the Western world depends on. But 45 million people live across those 3 nations. Their security matters. Meanwhile, inside Russia, something is happening that could reshape the war in Ukraine and the broader confrontation between Moscow and the West. Russia's economy minister has publicly admitted the country's financial reserves have largely been used up. Russia's gross domestic product is shrinking. The ruble has lost significant purchasing power. Inflation inside Russia is running well above the official figures that the Kremlin publishes. The sanctions regime imposed by the European Union, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine is working slowly, painfully, with collateral costs to the sanctioning countries themselves, but working. Russia entered this period with roughly $600 billion in foreign exchange reserves. A significant portion has been frozen by Western governments. The rest has been drawn down to subsidize a war economy burning through resources at a rate the country cannot sustain indefinitely. The European Union last week approved a $106 billion loan package to help Ukraine meet its military and economic needs for the next 2 years. And now Russia's own economy minister is standing in front of the world and confirming the reserves are gone. Here is a connection I want you to hold in your mind. Russia is running out of money. Iran is being blockaded and losing hundreds of millions of dollars daily. Both countries have been supporting each other. Iran provided Russia with Shahed drones used in attacks on Ukrainian cities. Russia provided Iran with diplomatic cover at the United Nations Security Council through its permanent veto. These 2 nations were meant to be the foundation of an alternative geopolitical bloc, the axis of resistance to American and Western dominance. Right now, both of them are in serious economic trouble simultaneously. That changes what is possible, and it changes what desperation might drive them to do. Let us bring this home to the people who are not generals or diplomats or heads of state. In the Mississippi Delta, one of the most important agricultural regions in the United States, where cotton and soybeans and rice have been grown for generations, where the soil is some of the richest on earth, where black farmers have fought for decades just to stay on land that was systematically stolen from them through discriminatory federal lending practices well into the 21st century, farmers are at a breaking point. Tariffs have raised the cost of equipment parts. Fertilizer prices tied to natural gas costs are elevated because of the global energy disruption caused by the Hormuz crisis. Diesel costs more. Credit costs more. Markets that Mississippi Delta farmers depend on, China buys enormous quantities of American soybeans, have been disrupted by retaliatory tariffs that Beijing imposed in direct response to Washington's trade aggression. The Commodity Credit Corporation Act of 1938 created the framework for American farm support precisely because the federal government recognized that agricultural markets are uniquely vulnerable to price shocks. The farmers are caught between forces entirely beyond their control, a trade war, an energy war, and a shooting war, and the cumulative weight of those decisions lands on the people working the land. The United Nations World Food Programme has meanwhile issued a warning that food insecurity is now alarmingly high across 10 countries. Gaza, where war has demolished agricultural infrastructure, destroyed irrigation systems, and made humanitarian aid delivery intermittently impossible because of military operations and checkpoint restrictions. Sudan, where a civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces has created what the United Nations calls one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes on Earth, with famine conditions spreading into regions where people have never experienced it. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, Haiti, Syria, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Afghanistan, 10 countries where people are looking at empty plates and an uncertain future. The Famine Early Warning Systems Network was built precisely to give the world advance warning so the international community could act before people died. The warnings are being issued, the action is not following. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 empowers the president to direct foreign aid. The current administration has been cutting those flows at precisely the moment the crisis is worst, and Georgia, the American state, not the country, is burning. Over 120 homes destroyed, more than 40,000 acres scorched amid what fire officials are calling an extreme drought. Fire scientists have been warning for years that climate change extends wildfire seasons, intensifies drought conditions, and pushes fire risk into regions that historically never faced it at this scale. Georgia is not California. Its emergency services were not built around the assumption that they would be fighting infernos of this magnitude in spring. Its residents did not move there expecting to watch their homes go up in smoke. And yet here they are. The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act exists for exactly these situations, providing the legal framework for federal disaster declarations, for mobilizing the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for directing federal dollars to devastated communities. Whether that machinery is moving with the urgency that over 120 destroyed homes demands is a question the people of Georgia are asking as they watch the smoke fill their sky. So let me pull all of this together for you, because here is the thing. These are not separate news stories happening in isolated corners of a large world. They are all symptoms of the same underlying crisis, a crisis of governance, of international order, of a world in which the institutions built after the Second World War to prevent exactly this kind of cascading chaos are bending under pressures they were not fully designed to bear. The United Nations Security Council cannot function when 2 of its 5 permanent members are under military or economic siege. International trade law cannot function when the world's largest economy is simultaneously conducting a tariff war, a naval blockade, and a shooting war. Democratic norms cannot function when a sitting president's social media posts are actively undermining his own diplomats. On Iran, the cancellation of the peace mission is a signal that military pressure is becoming the primary language of negotiation. Iran will not capitulate simply because it is being blockaded. History tells us Cuba in 1962, North Korea for 3 decades, Russia since 2022, that regimes under maximum pressure do not simply fold, they find asymmetric responses. And in Iran's case, that means a strait through which 20% of the world's oil travels stays closed. Oil at $150 a barrel. Economies in recession, farmers in Mississippi squeezed even harder. On Russia, a weakening Russian economy is not automatically a pathway to peace. It can be a pathway to escalation if the Kremlin decides its window of opportunity is closing and calculates it needs to act more aggressively before running out of resources. The world learned this lesson with Germany in 1914 and again in 1939. Declining powers are often more dangerous than rising ones because they operate under a time pressure that incentivizes risk-taking. On the Sahel, the Bamako attack tells us that the Russian model for West Africa, replace French forces with contractors, install compliant military governments, suppress all dissent, and call it stability, is not working. The insurgency is spreading, the humanitarian consequences are severe and deepening. The longer the world ignores this, the more the Sahel becomes a safe haven, an export hub for extremist violence that does not respect borders. On American democracy, the shooting at the Correspondents' Dinner is one more data point in a deeply troubling pattern. January 6th, the Butler rally, Ryan Routh, now Cole Allen. The United States is a country where political violence is becoming a recurring feature of public life. The response in gun legislation, in political rhetoric, in a media ecosystem that profits from outrage and division at any cost has been wholly inadequate. A bulletproof vest saved the evening last night. The next time, there may not be a vest. And on the Pope, when a newly elected head of the world's largest religious institution rebukes the most powerful government on earth within days of taking office, that is a moral marker being placed in the ground. Societies eventually reckon with the choices their governments made in times of fear. The firing squad announcement will be part of that reckoning. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely, this is the kind of coverage that takes time, that requires connecting dots. Others prefer to leave disconnected. And your attention and your trust are what make it possible and what keep this kind of honest journalism alive. Subscribe if you have not. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me which story you think is being most dangerously ignored. Tell me if you disagree with my analysis, because this conversation matters. The world is moving fast and in directions that affect every one of us. Whether we are watching from Washington or Karachi or Lagos or London, eyes are open. Stay curious, stay informed. We will see you next time.